Boa tarde a todos. Desculpem o atraso, a gente vai começar o evento agora. Eu queria passar a palavra ao presidente da mesa, Dr. Rudy Tavares.
Boa tarde a todos os presentes. Agradeço a presença de todos, o interesse de todos. São dois temas extremamente importantes no cenário de discussão do direito contemporâneo, especialmente o que a gente está vivendo hoje no Brasil e no estado do Rio de Janeiro. Queria agradecer a presença de todos os membros que estão compondo essa mesa. Anderson Schreiber, chefe do Sejur, Nathalie Jordano, procuradora assistente, os procuradores Antônio Murta e Rafael Nogueira, e, evidentemente, as professoras Indra, Spiecker e Astrid Wallrabenstein. A professora Indra Spiecker é pesquisadora de Direito Administrativo e Constitucional, especialista em proteção de dados e na lei de informações, na regulação de TI e tecnologia, no risco e na incerteza da lei. Utiliza ciências vizinhas em sua metodologia legal, incluindo direito comportamental e economia, bem como ciência da computação. É uma das principais acadêmicas de proteção de dados da Alemanha sobre GDPR, que é o Regulamento Geral de Proteção de Dados da União Europeia. Em 2016, foi nomeada membro da Academia Nacional de Ciências e Engenharia, a ACATEC, e atua regularmente como consultora de governos federais e estaduais, de instituições públicas e privadas, de ONGs, da União Europeia, de corporações e escritórios. Foi nomeada como conselheira legal perante o Tribunal Constitucional Alemão e vai falar sobre o novo Regulamento Europeu de Proteção de Dados. A professora Astrid Wallrabenstein vai falar sobre direito à saúde na Alemanha, e ela é doutora em Direito Constitucional da Cidadania, foi presidente do Departamento de Direito Público, Direito Educacional e Direito Previdenciário da Universidade de Bielefeld. Desde outubro de 2010, é professora de Direito Público, com foco em Direito Social na Universidade Johann Wolfgang Goethe, de Frankfurt am Main, e diretora executiva do Instituto de Política Europeia da Saúde e Direito Social, INEGES. Desde 2012, é membro do Conselho Consultivo Social do Governo Federal. Juíza no Tribunal Social do Estado de Hesse e membro do Conselho Consultivo BAföG, Lei Federal Alemã de Assistência Financeira do Governo Federal. Então, vou expor basicamente a sistemática que a gente vai adotar hoje nesse seminário. A professora Indra vai começar falando sobre o novo Regulamento Europeu de Proteção de Dados, e o procurador Antônio Murta vai ser o debatedor, pontuando alguns aspectos importantes para o debate que está sendo travado hoje no cenário nacional. Depois eu vou passar a palavra para a professora Astrid, que vai falar sobre direito à saúde na Alemanha, e em seguida o debatedor será o procurador Rafael Nogueira, que vai pontuar também alguns aspectos interessantes, tentando fazer a ponte entre a experiência alemã e o debate atual na jurisprudência nacional. Então, sem mais atrasos, com a palavra, a professora Indra Spiecker.
Perfect. That should work. And I need something for the presentation. Okay, great. Thank you very much for inviting Astrid and me here. It's a great pleasure, it's a great honor to speak to you. And it's a privilege to present one of the latest legislative efforts that we have in the European Union, and that is the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. What I will present in the next couple of minutes, about 40 minutes, is a new legislative effort to regulate digitalization. And digitalization right now is something which is buzzing around everywhere. We are hearing... Where do I have to point it at? Which direction is the... I started it earlier and it worked. There it is. Okay. And where do I point it at? Okay. Sorry about this. Technology. The buzzwords we hear right now are privacy, data protection, the right to be forgotten, digitalization as such, individual human rights, deep learning, data ownership. There are lots of concepts, and if we wanted to talk, we could talk a lecture like this easily on any of these topics. What I will try to do is connect some of these issues to the data protection law. And as we will see, data protection law right now is probably the informational law which covers most of these topics. After a short introduction, which will include an idea of what data protection is about, how it is protected as such, I will give you a presentation on the General Data Protection Regulation as such, and then I will show you some effects of profiling and personalization as very special techniques in digitalization and their effects on democracy, and I will finish with a conclusion and outlook. Can we somehow change this a little bit? Information data, which is protected by data regulation, is a very special good. It is, in the economic sense, a public good, meaning there's a so-called non-rivalry in consumption, and there's often a non-excludability. Trade secrets is a different issue, and I'm very glad that I have a discussant who is a trade secret and copyright law expert, intellectual property. Maybe in the discussion we will hear some of this. What does it mean, non-rivalry in consumption and non-excludability? Usually, if you eat a piece of banana, then only you can eat that piece of banana. And if someone wants to take it away from you, then you can protect it. Information is something, if someone takes that from you, you can use it still. Everybody else can still use it. So more than just a person can make use of it. And the second thing is, if someone wants to take it away from you, you have no means to protect it. We all see that we're sitting in this room, that we're listening to this lecture. This is information that's shared easily. It doesn't hurt anyone. So the economic theory tells us if there is such a common good, then often we observe market failure, because in the market where there's non-excludability, you do not get a price for what it is that you have given. And this is usually the reason for state intervention, state regulation, so that we create a functioning market, a level playing field. This level playing field is exactly what the data protection regulation aims at achieving here. The problem arising from information as a special good is that information infringements are very difficult to detect. Consummation is still possible, unlike a banana. We do not find it easy for technological reasons to detect even that information was used. Often information is not used as such. It's not something to nourish us or feed us or to consummate, but it's used to create a certain result of a decision. And that result of a decision is something where we often do not see that a certain type of information has been included in it. Sometimes we're able to say that. For example, if a certain result is only possible if the person who made the decision made use of a specific type of information, it's fairly easy for you to say, where did you get that information from? But if, for example, if you have a score, which is the number resulting from numerous information about you, it's very difficult to say whether the right type of information went into that score, whether the score was actually evaluated properly, etc. So we can only look at the outcome usually, and that does not tell us for sure whether information has been used legally. Then with digitalization, information can very easily be recombined, and that's what digitalized projects, what profiling does. Well, if you are just one slight bit of information in a whole big pond of such, it's very difficult to find out that your information is in there. And finally, it would be wonderful if the technology helped us to detect such infringements, but it's very costly to do so, and often technology is just as ineffective as thinking about the concept as such. Considering this, we see that enforcement of protection of all sorts of information, not just personal data, what the GDPR is about, but any type of protection of information is usually very difficult. It becomes even more difficult because we see a market in which we have mostly globalized players, not national players. We see that there's a legal differentiation worldwide. The legal systems in Europe are very different from the legal systems in the United States. The Brazilian government, the Brazilian legislation has just passed in its first step in the House a new data protection bill. Before that, you only had prior types of regulation, for example, for the internet, etc. Then, as a consequence of differentiated legal concepts, we have differentiated legal court decisions. The remedies often are unclear under state laws, and it's a high cost for every individual to pursue their individual informational rights in a worldwide effort. I'm pretty sure none of you, and I can only speak to myself, has tried to enact their information rights in any other country but your own, and even I have never sued in front of a German court for my German data privacy rights. Then, under the prior act that we had in the European Union, and that's also the case in very many other legislation, we have very little remedies against infringement of information rights because they don't hurt anyone. It's not a property right concept. And so there usually is no damage system for the violation of virtual rights. And we have no punitive damages in very many legal systems. So basically, if there is a violation, there's no remedy. And if there's no remedy, that's an incitement to even more damaging. Finally, we see that court decisions are very unclear in scope and content, and that the range of protection itself is often unclear. Where does it apply? All of these questions have arisen in Europe just as well as all over the world. And Europe used to have a regulatory content on data protection even before the general data protection regulation that we see now. The modern technology, digitalization now, caused a lot of new threats to what we call privacy, and that's the concept behind data protection. One is that automated data processing makes it so easy to access information in a very efficient way. All of a sudden, wherever you are, use your smartphone and you can have access on any place on this world, basically as long as you have some sort of access to the internet. Then digitalization allows for very fast and inexpensive recombination of data and data exchange due to its binary structure. Digital storage is fairly easy. All of you easily store huge amounts of data on your smartphone, on your home computers, etc. The content of communication is particularly sensitive in many cases because from the results, from the knowledge, who you're communicating with, how often, how frequently, how intensively, what are the topics you exchange, you can often derive additional information that's indirectly available. We have the new technology of big data and cloud computing, which basically means that you have the data stored in places where you don't have access to yourself, but the provider does, and that could be all over the world. The newest trend now is automated decision-making, what we sometimes call deep learning. It basically means that it's algorithms that perform self-learning tasks. It's used in mobility systems particularly. So these automated algorithms are all of a sudden not only able to do what they were told, that is programmed to do, but they reprogram themselves, they assess a situation, they even assess their own purposes and can change that according to the situation. So those who originally started and programmed a self-learning algorithm are usually not able to identify the results that self-learning algorithm then creates afterwards. And this leads us, particularly in mobility systems, into the problem of what I call systemic digitalization. All of a sudden, we lose in a system with very many different platforms, systems, information services on these platforms. basically the approach to who is still responsible, who can we address as a state, as legislator, in order to pursue and follow certain obligations and duties. So all of this means we need to think about a concept how to protect data. And protection of data does not mean that we stop all of this, but that we regulate it and that we think about what are the purposes we want as positive purposes and what are the purposes we rather dislike and therefore try to stop from taking place. Now, how is data protection so far in the European context protected? It's protected on all levels. So it's in the European Convention on Human Rights, a particularly Human International Rights Treaty. It is protected in the EU Charter, which is something like the EU Constitutional Treaty. It's protected in most of Europe's national, individual, and human rights constitutions. What's protected there is what we call privacy, what is called informational self-determination. Sometimes it's covered by the terminology of family. That's particularly the case in the European Convention on Human Rights. Privacy and informational self-determination are at the core of the European concept. Now, what does that mean? It's specified in the particular laws of the EU. It started out in 1995 with a directive on data protection. It was followed and specified for internet, telecommunication, telemedia services by the directive in 2002. Different from the first directive of 1995, which was now followed by the GDPR, the directive 2002 was meant to be overworked and also changed according to the new standards in data protection, but so far the EU has not come to a result here, so it's still valid, and that causes a lot of friction between the GDPR and the e-privacy directive, what the directive 2002 is called. Then we also used to have, because of the structure of European law, specific member state laws on particular technologies. In the result, what I just described as a general globalized problem on the regulation of data protection occurred even more so on the European level. We had different approaches to privacy and data protection within the member states because they were following the goals and purposes of the directives, but they were doing it in their own particular way. They interpreted it in their own particular way. And the enforcement by the data protection authority differed within the member states, although the same issues arose. And this meant we had strategic behavior of data processors, data controllers, and that again meant that we had an increase of differentiation and of legal uncertainty. So this is the background on which the General Data Protection Regulation was enacted, and it's valid as of May 25th, 2018, so it's really, really fresh. What is protected in there? It's protected what is the core content of data protection, that's personality rights. It's the idea behind it that all of us have an undefinable personality, which has a lot of content. One of the strongest contents of personality protection is that to be able to change. And if you know something about someone else, and you confront that person with their behavior, with their attitudes, with their decisions prior to a certain situation, then you can, and all of you have been in this situation probably, then you can easily predict what those people are doing. And also, if you realize someone else knows something about it, you will probably start changing your own behavior according to the standards of the person who's judging you. So personality rights is a way of protecting exactly that situation to occur, to give you freedom to change, freedom to decide differently. This leads immediately to data protection being the backbone of other rights, for example, to demonstrate, to free assembly, to coalition, to free opinion of speech. Because if you feel as an autonomous human being, you will make use of those human rights. If you feel there's someone controlling this, you will stop from doing that if you fear that there will be negative decisions based on your participation in a coalition, in an assembly, etc. And this forms the bottom line, basically. It's the protection of autonomous decision-making, of not being manipulated, of being treated as a subject and not of an object, and that relates immediately, also in the face of the German history, to the protection of dignity. But the concept as such is very strong in the European Union as such. Now, how does data protection law go about the protection? It does so by basically two different instrumental approaches. The one is data protection deals with automated decision making. So it's a technology regulation. As such, it follows the principle of all technology regulation, and that's that of the precautionary principle. The idea behind the precautionary principle is that we don't know what's going to happen, so we rather be careful. And so the precautionary principle allows a very step-by-step approach. It even allows, in certain circumstances, to forbid a particular technology if we don't know where it is heading us to. The second string, and this is one that data protection has picked up lately particularly, and I give you an example of that later on, is that we see there is a market failure regulation, a consumer protection issue in it as well. So the idea is if there's a market failure in data markets, then data protection will help give us rules under which a market can function. And the second is it will protect consumers' data subjects as such. Privacy, as the concept behind it, is therefore meant to exist as a whole. It exists in the public sphere. If you enter a room like this, if you're out on any of the places here, if you're at the airport, etc. The second is that privacy is a larger concept sometimes than data protection because it also protects certain spheres, for example, your apartment, your office. And data protection often depends on your individual attitude, what you think your privacy is, what you think will hamper with your autonomous decision-making. It's not something where you use an approach of what's typical, what's normal, what's useful. Although as lawyers, we all know sometimes you do have to standardize. I'm pointing this out because the US concept of privacy is something completely different. It's based on the idea of an extension of the violation of your property. So it's the right of trespass which is often addressed. And this means in the US context, you always have to have a physical contact, which in the virtual world, how do you really perform that? And secondly, we all know information is not something which you physically grab. So often you will have to find ways to find an infringement, although there was no physical attack on this. So be aware, the European concept and the American concept use similar terminology, but have very different concepts behind that. Having said that, as an introduction to the concept, I would like to follow now on an overview. It cannot be more than an overview of what the General Data Protection Regulation provides. The goal is to create a new unified, a harmonized approach within Europe and for all of Europe. It's a reaction to the new technology, and it is in the end a reaction also to the EU Charter Treaty, which was passed between 1995 and now, and which includes both a protection of family and privacy and a protection of data as such. I would like to start with what remains the same, and that's a lot. In Europe and also in some of the businesses who are dealing with information, there's been a huge uproar, sort of this, what is Europe doing? It's terrible, they're ruining our businesses, etc., etc. I can only say most of the things where now they argue it's ruining the business have been illegal before, but they simply were not well enforced before, so people simply did what they wanted to do. And now we have enforcement. So what we see on what remains the same is the core idea, and that is you need to have consent or a law as a justification for data processing. Otherwise, it's not legal. We see that most of the definitions have remained the same. I will explain that on the personal data definition. We see that the rights of data subjects are still strong, and you could even argue they are much stronger now. We see that there's the approach of so-called technological neutrality, meaning that we have hardly any regulation for particular types of data processing, which is a problem, as we will shortly see in certain regards. However, what we see are some changes. One is the end of the so-called territoriality principle. It's now the market principle, and I will shortly explain what that is. Secondly, what we see, and this is probably one of the strongest changing points here, is that the member state authorities have been heavily strengthened. They are now able to give out penalties, to fine. They have particularly rights, they have an obligation to protect the individual rights and also to address authorities if they make any illegal data processings. What we also see is that we have some new tools, and that's the risk impact assessment, and also that we have a requirement now for increased organizational and technical measures, what we call privacy by design. The idea is if we as individuals are unable to protect ourselves, maybe because of the common good problem, then technology should help us. And that means we need data protection friendly technology where it's predisposed so that data protection is the standard and not the exemption. And finally, what we see is that there's coherence procedure in order to assure that there's a harmonized approach, that all of the member states speak with one voice. Also, at the same time, we want companies to speak only to one authority and not to 28 member state authorities, or even more so, because some member states have, because of a federal system, several authorities. So the idea is to make it easier for companies to communicate with the authorities, and in all of that, to gain more legal certainty than we had so far. Let me start with some of the core concepts, and that's the material scope of the GDPR. It's only applicable as personal data is processed. So it's not a protection of trade secrets, of copyright law, of intellectual property as such. Sometimes that goes together, but it's not aimed at that. And it's not, even though there are consumer protection, market regulation aspects in there, it's not in its core an economic law and economic regulation, although its effects, of course, are exactly that. Personal data remains what it has always been. It's information that can identify a natural person, where a natural person can be identified. And we've just had a European Court of Justice judgment which declared that dynamic IP addresses, which are used whenever you access the internet, also are personal data, because legally the state has access to making the link between the person and the IP address. And that in its result will also affect the data processor, because there's a legal way to make that connection. If it was only an illegal means that was not practiced frequently, then that would indeed be exclusive. This means that the data processor has to pay attention not only to the knowledge he has in order to identify, but also to third parties. And this is a very wide-reaching concept. However, the data protection regulation does not aim at forbidding data processing, but rather at regulating it. So although personal data is a very far-reaching concept, there are many, and I will show you that certainly, justifications how data can actually be processed. But it has to basically cross a certain threshold in order to do that. New is the so-called market principle approach. And that means whenever you offer goods or services to data subjects in the EU, that's number one, or secondly, if you want to monitor the behavior of someone within the EU, then you fall under the data protection regulation. This means when you offer a service as a business, which is addressing customers in Portuguese, then that's most likely that this is not aiming at EU citizens, because most of the people who speak Portuguese do not live in Europe, but in Brazil. If, however, you decide, because maybe you live in a town in Rio Grande do Sul with strong German inhabitants of ancestry, you decide to have a homepage in German with your services, well, unfortunately, there's still more Germans in German than have moved to Brazil, so this is a clear indicator that you're offering your services to someone within the EU. It goes even one step further, because if you travel to Europe, you're within the EU, so you are protected. And the Facebook, WhatsApp, Googles, Amazons of this world now fall under the GDPR if they offer services to you as long as you're staying in the United States. If you think this has somewhat an imperialistic touch about it, which has been one of the arguments, does it really? If there's medication from Iceland to be used in Brazil, wouldn't you want it to follow Brazilian standards so that you can be sure it's the medication to the standards of the medical system here? I would. And I know that's the case with cars, that's the car with pharmaceutical things, that's the reason why we import certain goods only under certain instructions and export them, etc., etc. So what this market principle is all about is linking virtual goods, information, to substantial goods, and that is cars, cows, whatever. So the idea is basically the same. What, in addition to that, must be noted is this is also applicable even if you offer services for free. This was clearly addressed at most of the information providers and service providers in the internet, where the deal is basically you get the service for free, but I may use your data and you will never know what I do with the data. Problem is there's no enforcement regulation in the GDPR. So for those of you who run a business in Brazil and have a German homepage, as long as you don't have any assets in Germany, well, there's not much that can be done against you if you don't follow the rules. However, most have some assets in the EU, so we'll see what that happens. What remains the same if you have created some sort of establishment, and that's understood very widely, then the GDPR certainly applies as it has done before. Processing. It has always been debated in the past under the directive whether processing meant everything and anything, or whether it only meant if the data processor actively did something with the data. It was the problem with Facebook, for example, where information was passed to Facebook, and Facebook always argued the first step of data processing they were actively doing was taking place on the Seychelles or wherever their servers are standing, and thus they were never falling under Brazilian or European law because they were not doing data processing in the first step. The European Court of Justice has cleared that up 4 years ago and has made clear that processing is a wide concept. And the GDPR now extends that even more so and basically says anything you do with data is processing as long as it's automatically done. So there's no differentiation anymore between the purpose you're doing this for or the content, but it's processing, period. The consequences of this concept are quite far-reaching, and that's the case because the core concept of data protection is that you have a linkage between the data processing and its justification by a particular purpose. So the first step of data processing determines the purpose, and that then determines the validity of all further steps. So if you collect data for a particular purpose and then store it and then change it and then offer it to a third party, all of that will be justified if it's still the same purpose you're doing this for which you collected the original data. I will shortly show you that the purpose is something which has been changed, the purpose limitation, but we'll see that in just a minute. The consequences are all of these steps need justification. And secondly, the purpose still remains very important. It has to be an explicit, specified, and legitimate purpose for which you process data. So it's not the kind of, well, I've got the data, so I keep it, even if I don't know what I'm going to do with it. This leads to the core, when is data processing legitimate? And there are basically two forms under which this can be justified. The one is consent, the second is a legal norm that justifies. Consent is basically the same concept that we've had before. It's the idea of informed consent. You can only consent to something if you know what you're consenting to. So you need the information of who is processing your data, for what purpose, for how long, where is it going, are there other purposes, who has access to that. All of that you still need to know under the concept of informed consent. It can be withdrawn any time, which makes it sometimes difficult, but it can only be withdrawn for the future, not for the past. So all that has been done under consent remains justified. And there are special regulations for children, which I'm not going to go into detail. More interesting is, because consent is something very out in the open, it's protective, you have a choice, basically. That's behind the idea of consent. Most of the companies now doing data processing, or the state doing data processing, and we should not forget the state is quite interested in data as well, personal data as well, is a legal justification. And the GDPR gives basically 6 different types. The first is consent. Then we have if the information is necessary, and I mean necessary, for the contractual obligations. So of course, if you buy a book in the internet, they need your name, your address, and your account information from your bank, but they don't need to know whether you like horses or dogs. Second is if there's a legal obligation under state or EU law. Thirdly, if there are vital interests either of the data subject or a third party. This covers all kind of data processing for catastrophic reasons. For example, if there is some kind of a huge disease problem spreading, then that would be one of the reasons. Then we have if the state, and this is exclusively for the state, is performing a task of data processing in the public interest, and I will shortly go into that. And then finally, we have the core content. And this is where I criticize the GDPR very strongly because it's such a broad norm. If you think of all the different types of data processing, like a video surveillance in a public sphere, the data processing if you buy a ticket to find out whether you like ballet more than opera or not, the evaluation of a session somewhere in law school or in school or something, the processing of data if you enroll in a private club. All of that is covered by Article 6, Section 1, Lit F, and that is a balancing of interest test, meaning you have to evaluate the interest of the data processor and the interest of the data subject. Then you have to weigh them. If the balancing of interest tests shows that the interest of the data subject overweighs the interest of the, no, it's this way, the interest of the controller, then it's fairly easy because then the data subject wins, meaning the data processing may not take place. If it's the other way around, so the scale goes down in favor of the data processor while the data subject's interests remain a bit on top, then the processing may take place and it is legitimate. The problem is what if the scale remains evened out, balanced? And this is one of the reasons why I would argue the data protection regulation is certainly not what it is sometimes claimed to be a very prohibitive standard. It would be if it was different than it is. But as it is, if there is a balanced interest, the data processor wins, and he may process the data. So the data subject is only protected if his or her interest is the supervailing one. And that creates, of course, incentives for data processors to make sure that the balancing of interest goes at least into the balance, if not in their favor. And then they may justified process the data. The GDPR is a regulation, which means it's directly applicable. The member state's law is not existent anymore. However, the regulation includes a number of so-called opening clauses, which means here the regulation allows the member states to do specific regulation or to change what the data protection regulation has actually enacted. One of the core changes, opening clauses here, is in Article 6, Section 2 for the public sector, meaning that the member states may introduce more specific and their individualized regulation either on the legal obligation of processors, for example, for tax reasons, etc., or if data processing is taking place by the state in the public interest. And in that case, and that's where we will see a lot of member state law still being in place, now being freshly enacted. For public interest data processing, we will have very different member state law as we had before. However, that's only true for the justification. It's not true for all of the other obligations which are in the GDPR. For example, on the risk impact assessment, on having control by the data protection authorities, on particular procedural standards that exists. What remains the same, so I'm just repeating this to remind you of what data protection as the European standard is like, is the principles relating to processing of personal data. It has to be lawful, fair, and transparent. There's a purpose limitation. Data minimization is the principle. Data must be accurately stored. It must be limited in its storage. There must be integrity, IT security guaranteed, and confidentiality. And, new now, a principle of accountability. So anyone who's processing data now is obliged to be able to give account that it is a justified data processing. And this means we will have a lot of documentation necessary now to show that it was justified what the data processing is doing. These principles are not left to any of the bargaining powers of the parties. And this is something where you can see consumer protection law. There's no possibility for the stronger party to impose a change of these rules and principles on the weaker party. Now, one of the things which has changed is the purpose limitation. It used to be, as I declared earlier, if there's one purpose at the first step of data processing, that binds all consecutive steps. And if you want another purpose to be applied to these data, then you will have to declare that, and you will have to test for justification on a new justification again. This has now been changed conceptually a little bit, and that is we now see that there is a so-called compatible purpose, which means you have a different purpose, but if it's a so-called compatible purpose, it's considered to be compatible, as the name says, to the original purpose. And thus, you may simply perform the new purpose data processing, although it's a new purpose. This also enlarges the possibilities for data processing. Now, how do I determine whether it's compatible? Basically by looking at context, and that means if it's in a contractual relationship, is the new way, the new purpose in a close linkage to the original purpose? Is there a close connection between the data subject and controller, maybe an interest of the data subject to have that data used in the particular new type of processing purpose? The type of data, is it very personal, very strict data, or is it rather unimportant data? What are the potential consequences of that further processing, and are there appropriate safeguards, particularly against third parties having access to that information? Let me now come to the enforcement part, and this is where it's been strengthened a lot. What we have so far is a parallel approach. So we still have individual remedies, the good old idea of subjective rights. If your right is interfered with, then you protect it yourself, and you are your own best lawyer. But we also have supervisory authorities, and we've always had them in data protection. The idea behind that is, think again of the common good approach, we are often as individuals not able to protect ourselves. So we need someone who has the technology behind him or her, the supervisory authority. We need someone who has the resources to go after certain things where we as individuals simply don't have the time and the resources, the money and the competence to do that. The individual remedies are broadened. So there's a whole list of rights that you have. It starts out with the right to access what type of information is stored. It goes to the right to transparency, to compensation and liability, the right to erasure, the so-called right to be forgotten, which is a stupid denomination, the right to restrict processing, and I'll answer questions on that in the discussion, the so-called right to data portability. And this last right is actually not a data protection right. It's the idea behind it that you may take your data from one network to another network. And this is something which is supposed to increase a market, because you have usually in networks natural monopolies, but if you have data portability, then you can create alternative, competitive social networks, and that's the idea behind that. Also, there's a right now to mandate your legal remedies to a non-for-profit body so that they take care of your matter. This is, again, the idea there's a common good. Individuals usually do not have the resources and the ability to follow their own infringements. The right to compensation and liability is now also eased in its way. As far as I understand, this will be accessible over the internet, so you may easily look it up. I'm not going into detail here, just put it up there for your information so you know a bit better on the individual remedy part here. The supervisory authorities now have the right to forbid data processing. They can warn a data processor that they're going to forbid. They can ban a particular processing, they can restrict it, they can simply inform the public, and they can fine. And that's something which has made headlines worldwide, I believe. And that is administrative fines can reach up to 20 million euros. That's somewhere in the range, I believe, of maybe 90 million Brazilian reais. or up to 4% of the total worldwide turnover of the data processor. And you should know for the number of 4%, that's about the amount a worldwide operating company, aims at as a gain. So if you take away 4%, then basically you take away all their gain. And that has made headlines because if you are a company and you have a shareholders meeting and you have had to pay 4% of your gain, the shareholders will want to know why you didn't follow the advice of the supervisory authority. Because, of course, you're not going to be fined 20 million or 4% right away just because you've done something little wrong or so. But usually it's ultima ratio. So the supervisory authority will have warned you before, they will have informed you, they will have taken action, and you have not followed. And that's when this comes into play. And also note, just because you pay a fine, it's a fine. It's not something by which you can basically buy yourself out of the obligation. You pay the fine and you still have to oblige to whatever the authority wanted you to do. One thing which for an outsider is very strange, and it's really new as an instrument, is the so-called one-stop shop principle, which means that within the so-called board, where all of the national supervisory authorities are located, within that board there will be a communal collective action, so that they will speak with one voice, and this will be by the lead authority. So if there's a Brazilian company and you want to operate in the EU, you will not have to address the German, the Spanish, the French, the British, the Irish, and the Czech authorities, but you will be able to identify who is the lead authority, and that authority is the one I communicate with. If that authority or any other authority wants to take action against you, then they will have to address it in the board. The board will have a majority rule on whether action and what type of action is taking, and that's communicated by the lead authority again. The enforcement then is done by the national authority, so it might be if you have assets in Spain, but the lead authority is in Germany, the lead authority will then issue a certain decree, but it will be enforced in Spain. I would like just very shortly to point out a couple of effects of what we see in digitalization on democracy. And I would like to use the example of profiling. The idea of profiling is that you use big and smart data, so that you use huge amounts of data, you clarify by certain scores or profiles how particular groups of people act, decide what preferences they have, and in the end, basically you base a decision on an individual's behavior on those scores or profiles. The idea behind that for companies who make use of that is that they create an information asymmetry, because you as a data subject have absolutely no clue what the profile looks like, what score you have been assessed. And this is something which is protected by trade secrets, at least under European standards. So you have no access to that information, although it's extremely valuable. And how valuable that is can be seen, for example, in the China Citizen Score, where China as a state uses this system in order to assess whether you and your children are able to take a vacation outside of Europe, whether you will be able to buy a particular house, whether your children will have access to a certain university, etc., etc. So this is a heavy impact we're talking. The other example is Cambridge Analytica, which has made headlines where you have strong marketing, basically, for a particular party on the basis of big and smart data assessed profiles. And personalized pricing, where you want to buy a book to Europe, and then you find out they see, or you don't find it out, but it's well known by now, that if you assess it from an Apple computer, then the prices will be higher than if you use a non-Apple computer. Because Apple computer holders usually have more money, so they can spend more money, so they get higher prices. You will find out when you use it from a non-Apple computer, but we usually don't do that, and we would be surprised. Same thing is, if you try to book that several times, then it shows you have a real interest, so the prices goes up, and particularly if you ask for certain data each time, so they see, she has to be there on, let's say, August 15th, and so we can raise the price because she's not willing to fly earlier or later. This is how profiling big data is used. Now, we do have in Article 35 now, the risk impact assessment, and profiling is mentioned there as one of those where you need a particular impact assessment, which is a strong procedural safeguard. But we don't really see any other safeguards for profiling, so the Article 6, Section 1, Literature F application is true here, just as it has been before. So a balancing of interests. How do you balance that if you don't really know what the score is, etc.? And we have protection against automated decision-making as such, so there always needs to be someone to controls. It's a very weak and procedure, and it's an opening clause in there, and most of the member states have weakened it even more. So we do have certain regulation of profiling, but it's not very well. It's one of those aspects where we would have truly wished for a more specified, non-technology neutral approach of the GDPR. Now, this has effects on democracy as well, because if we are profiled, if we are in that way personalized, we will get the information by information platforms pre-selected. And we will not be able to understand that there are other opinions out there. This is exactly what's happening in the United States right now, where you have news broadcasts which are selected on the internet. We have that in the China Citizen Score very easily performed. And we saw that in Cambridge Analytics taking place. So in what way does that contradict our democratic ideas? We believe a democracy builds on autonomous persons making autonomous choices. And so most of the laws, and as far as I understand, that's the case in Brazil too, in most of the electorate laws, we try to create, we're not always successful, but we try to create a system in which we have a balanced informational level, in which people are not manipulated. Personalized services overcome this easily, and you have absolutely no chance to find that out, because you don't know that someone else gets different information. So this hampers very much with our freedom of information, which our idea of public opinion, of personalized opinion, of autonomous decision-making. And this is something where we need legislation to take place. Let me conclude. Data protection is a core instrument in the protection against the consequences of IT which are undesirable. And I'm stressing this, of course not the desirable aspects. Decision-making and information asymmetries are a motor to call for more data protection, because the way the digitalization services have worked so far without regulation has shown that there's no level playing field, neither for competitors nor for data subjects. So we needed to procure individuality and autonomous decision-making. Data protection so far functions as the core information law. There is, of course, intellectual property. There is, of course, telecommunications infrastructure law, but they just cover certain areas. Data protection law so far covers most of the digitalized problems. Of course, there is a regulatory race between IT as the particular technology and law. But that is, and my colleague will shortly develop innovation to you, one of the core concepts of innovation. You need a free area in order to innovate. So the GDPR does not establish a completely new regime. It holds up the old standards which have always been there, but it creates a stronger enforcement, and that's what companies are afraid of. This will lead eventually to new markets in which data protection-friendly products all of a sudden have a chance, where we don't see an overwhelming power of social networks and of information services which have been aggressively disobeying existing laws. And so, in the end, the GDPR, and that's one of its core goals, intends and regulates towards a level playing field. Thank you very much for your attention. Obrigada, Michelle.
invertendo um pouco a dinâmica que eu havia explicado, nós vamos passar primeiro a palavra para a professora Astrid, que vai nos dar um mergulho sobre o modelo alemão de proteção do direito à saúde. Vamos sair agora de uma regulamentação europeia, de um regulamento unificado, para um vislumbre mais específico de um modelo que também pode vir a influenciar o debate brasileiro, agora especificamente em relação ao direito à saúde. Então, sem mais atrasos, passo a palavra para a professora Astrid.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I draw on a completely different topic, but I hope in the discussion we will meet again at the point of innovation. As I learned so far, I realize that here in Brazil you have a vivid discussion on how to claim the right to health care at the courts. And I think we have a kind of similar, not the same, but comparable debate in Germany as well. And that's why I want to introduce you our German discussion on the right to health as a right claimable in front of the courts, and my view on that. Over 10 years ago, in 2005, the German Federal Constitutional Court established the immediate constitutional right to health care treatment. An insured patient with a rare disease, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, who had exhausted all other treatment options, was convinced that magnetic resonance therapy would be beneficial to her. Conventional medicine at this point viewed this treatment as esoteric and of little benefit. Because of all other potential treatment options offered under the public health insurance had been exhausted, the Federal Constitutional Court agreed with the patient. The court decided that in cases of life-threatening and terminal diseases, insured patients have the right to treatment where the medical evidence associated with the treatment may be just limited, but the chances of cure or pain relief are not too remote. Under the German Constitution, this was pretty new. Such immediate constitutional rights are nonetheless part of the welfare state. This decision of 2005, as mentioned, was a leading case in this respect, and even more important was the subsequent decision in 2010, when the Federal Constitutional Court upheld an immediate constitutional guarantee of a subsistence minimum that is in line with human dignity. From a liberal, let's say, US-American perspective, this interpretation of the German constitutional guarantees of the welfare state could be seen as quite socialist. In my contribution today, I will propose that the constitutional right to health in the German healthcare system is an important and, I think, necessary catalyst for innovation. It is a good example, I think, to illustrate that basic human rights need not be seen to be diametrically opposed to liberal positions and goals. To expand on this proposition, I'll take the following steps. First, I'll outline roughly which aspects of innovation are relevant to my presentation on innovation in healthcare. I will then present the framework of the German healthcare system very shortly to show the incentives for innovation in it. I hope that we can see at this point then how the structure of the German healthcare provision has developed over the last, let's say, 20 years, and how this provision has furthered certain types of innovation and neglected others. Against this backdrop, finally, I'll show that the fundamental right to health has a potential to catalyze innovation. Okay, let's start with innovation. In economic theory, a lot of definitions of innovation and distinctions between different types of innovations and different dimensions of it are offered. They all agree that innovation is more than invention, as it is a value-added novelty. In the field of medicine and healthcare, it makes sense to differentiate two types, to differentiate two types of innovation with distinctly different goals. On the one hand, innovation can be aimed at making something possible that was previously deemed impossible. Flying, for example, electricity in former times, moon landing, or whatever you want. I'll call this novelty-oriented innovation. And on the other hand, innovation can be aimed at making something which is already possible, in principle, more efficient. For instance, in the mentioned examples, flying by using lesser materials, electricity by using fewer resources, and for the moon landing, maybe not landing there at all. In healthcare provision, we need both types of innovation. Firstly, it is good and desirable when new methods of treatment or new medicines are discovered. Furthermore, it is good and desirable that these treatments are efficiently applied and use up few resources, yet at this time are available to as many people as possible. The availability of vaccination is a good example for an innovation that must be driven first by novelty-oriented innovation and then by efficiency. Often both objectives cannot be achieved simultaneously. The framework for truly novel innovation is often such that it requires full resources so that efficiency plays little or no part in it. Under market conditions, the expectation of profit from innovation plays a crucial role. Somebody who innovates with the input of many resources will later expect the investment to make a return. Therefore, he has a desire to market it exclusively for a long period of time and to prevent others from copying the innovation. Trademarks and patent law have been developed to protect such interests. When and insofar as a medical innovation is available, people who can benefit from it, and these are the ill people, will have a desire for these innovations to be applied. If in a hypothetical marketplace the price for this innovation was determined by the offer of the monopolistic innovator and the patient's demand, the price would be very high and the sales opportunities very low. It is therefore one of the real crucial tasks of a healthcare system to make innovation available to all consumers, to all patients who are in need for it, and at the same time to enable the innovator to have full access to all patients. From the perspective of patients, the healthcare system realizes the right to health by granting access to medical innovation. Article 12 of the International Covenant of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights defines such a function of the healthcare system. Its paragraph 2, litera D, requires that the signatories to the convention provide the creation of the conditions which would assure to all medical service and medical attention in the event of sickness. A particular healthcare system might succeed in this task for the better or worse. Nonetheless, it should be evaluated in respect to its dealing with this kind of innovation. Under this heading, I wish to outline where and how the German healthcare system enables access to medical innovation. Different from Brazil, we do not have a public health service, but we have public health insurance. About 90% of the German population is insured and receives from this public health insurance services. The members pay income-related, I show you in this graph, the members pay income-related contributions to a central federal health fund, and this fund then distributes risk-adjusted lump sums for every insured person to one of the about 100 or 110 health insurance providers. These health insurance providers handle the payment to the service providers in return for their services to the insured. The physicians treat the insured patients, and the insurance providers pay a global payment to the Service Providers Association, and they distribute the whole amount again to the individual physicians. In certain instances, the insurance providers are able to influence health provisions through contracts with the service providers, and that I'll explain later on. First, I want to sketch this regular collective contract system. The breadth and depth of service provisions in this kind of service provisions, that is the outpatient care, is decided centrally. The most important functionaries in this respect sit here on the Federal Joint Committee, this one here. This and other committees developed a detailed catalogue of services provided for this outpatient care. Thereafter, every type of catalogue provision is allocated a score for the purposes of monetary compensation. Yeah? For this treatment in this catalogue, the physician gets a score, and the score defines the part of the global payment he will receive. Inpatient care, here on the right side, is regulated differently. For all inpatient care, the type of provision and payment for it is decided by each individual hospital and the regional health insurance provider. They use a fee-per-case system which pays a lump sum based on the diagnosis. The hospital is free to choose the type of treatment within the defined quality standards. With regard to innovation, the difference between in- and outpatient care is important. Before new examination or treatment methods can be introduced in the outpatient care, they have to be approved by the Federal Joint Committee. This here has to decide about new treatments. The approval will not only consider the benefits, but also the necessity and the economics of the method in comparison to those already approved. As a result, outpatient provision at the expense of the public health insurance remains in the boundaries of the tried and tested. Innovation only occurs when it pays. Inpatient care, on the other hand, allows hospitals to try new methods. In cases of particularly rare diseases or overcomplex complications, the diagnosis-related group system with the lump sums cannot be applied, and that enables hospitals to demand additional treatment-related compensation. This needs to be agreed on with the insurers, but the insurers are obliged to agree and carry the costs if there is no other adequate treatment available. The Federal Joint Committee has just not much to say in this inpatient care. It has a kind of limited veto right and can exclude methods proven to be problematic, but this rarely occurs. I have here this on the slide in bullet points again, but that's what I explained before. And I want to turn to the private health insurance now, because about 10% of the German population has a private health insurance only. This means that patients enter into contract directly with the healthcare providers, pay for the treatment, and reclaim later on the costs from their health insurer. The healthcare providers are free to choose the treatment methods. Costs are defined in a legally binding and for ages not recalculated fee schedule. Nonetheless, this schedule is very flexible and allows still to be applicable to all kinds of new treatments. Problem in this system is that the expenses of privately provided and billed health services are increasing. Recently, more and more privately insured are not able to recover completely all their medical costs from their insurers. That turns out to be a problem. these in bullet points again. And now I will turn to the question of how innovation is possible in this type of two-pillar system. We might assume that there are three major areas where innovation could take place, and that one I want to take a closer look on. The first is the private health insurance system as a second pillar, but next to the public one. For a long time in Germany, the view was widespread that innovation in the whole of the healthcare system resulted from the fact that there was a private health insurance parallel to the public system. Treatment constraints in the public system, justified by solidarity-based financing, could be counterbalanced by the service provider's chance to offer innovative methods and medicine to the privately insured. Out of this decade-long practice, there has always been pressure for the public health system to adopt, often for a lower price, innovative methods that established in the field of the privately insured and proved to be helpful. From a political perspective, this parallel system has been criticized as a two-tier system. From the perspective of innovation, we have to admit that the competition between the private and public insurance has promoted innovation. In particular, the two-tier system allowed high-price care to a small circle of consumers, but for a certain period of time, but after a while, a much lower price for provision to the whole population. However, since the financial crisis of 2008, the private health insurers are under unrelenting pressure. And in my opinion, this will bring about the downfall of the private health insurance as we know it. The problems lie with the financial models used by the private insurers, which require long-term high interest rates on the financial market. After 10 years of low interest rates, such models are not longer sustainable. To adjust the changes, the private insurers have amended the contract several times in the last years, and they will continue to do so. Already today, private insurance contracts resemble more and more those within the public insurance system in terms of the insured services. In respect to the contributions, private insurance may still be an alternative to the public one, but the potential for innovation facilitated by a better paying and less regulated system is slowly being lost by this tighter insurance contracts. I come to the second area, potential area for innovation. As I have mentioned earlier, in the public health insurance system, that is for 90% of the population, the financing of the healthcare providers is managed by about 100 health insurance providers. Many health insurers are signing selective contracts with single care providers, which means that a standalone pricing can be agreed on for innovative methods of treatments. At the same time, the health insurers have to convince their customers to sign into the treatment program arranged with a particular care provider. In practice, we see a broad variety of selective contracts with different care providers. A great number of these selective programs offer interesting services to the insured, and yet they are of little cost risk for the insurance funds. And this little cost risk is no surprise, considering the selective contracts having to be self-supporting financially and being an instrument of competition among insurers at the same time. That means if innovations serve to increase efficiency and reduce costs, the selective contract programs can encourage the implementation of these new methods. Savings achieved through this efficiency-oriented innovation can be used to finance popular add-on services like alternative medicine, for example. These additional services may attract customers, and that's in the interest of the insurers in their competition. This explains why the potential for innovation within these selective contracts is limited to the efficiency-oriented innovation. What remains as a third area is to look at the potential for innovation in inpatient care, which is not bound to a treatment catalogue. As already explained, there is a difference between in- and outpatient provision, and this difference serves also the purpose of concentrating and enabling innovation in inpatient care, where the resources are provided to deal with complications and complex problems. In all areas where the compensation for the hospitals is based on a case lump sum, the potential for innovation is naturally focused on increasing efficiency. Since any increase in provision efficiency remains in the hospital, the incentive for this type of innovation is high. On the other hand, the incentive does not encourage innovation entailing higher risks and higher costs, because the lump sum would not cover these additional costs. Therefore, novelty-oriented innovation in hospitals occurs only in those areas not covered by diagnosis-related lump sums, and these are concentrated in hospitals or highly specialized clinics. To come to a conclusion, I tried to show that the early incentives for innovation in the German healthcare system have in the last few decades clearly developed into an efficiency-oriented direction. In a nutshell, medical innovation occurs when costs can be reduced. That might be linked to a better treatment. However, when a better treatment is leading to higher costs, as it is the case when new methods are developed, because of the thereto related risks, the system offers little or no incentives for innovation. In this field of efficiency-oriented innovation catalysts, the initially introduced judgment of the Federal Constitutional Court on the constitutional right to health can be interpreted as counterbalance. In principle, the Federal Constitutional Court accepted the limits on public health care provisions and the associated focus on efficiency in the public health insurance. From the perspective of the care providers, there is no doubt that the public health insurance market is not opened to new methods that do not meet the standards of efficiency required by the Federal Joint Committee. Therefore, care providers have to focus their offer on the privately insured, and there are fewer and fewer of them who will still pay these treatments. Yet, for a very small group, the Federal Constitutional Court made an exception. Where a certain disease is life-threatening or regularly terminal, publicly insured patients should have access to all treatments, even those of uncertain benefit. This right to extraordinary treatment, so treatment that is not listed in the catalogue of approved methods, is subject to the condition that approved methods have been of no avail. From the perspective of innovation, this exception can be seen as an intended catalyst for innovation. When there is a lack of successful treatment, innovation should be possible and financed by the public system. But such innovation activity financed by the public system should not take place for any kind of treatment, but only when there's a chance to save life or to achieve palliative relief before approaching death. 6 years after this decision, in 2011, federal legislator took up this case law and that's important, extended it. In the German Code for Health Insurance, the entitlement for health provision outside the catalogue for regular provision has been confirmed for life-threatening, regularly terminal diseases, but the statute adopted this right also for comparably severe diseases. In other words, Parliament realized a broader right to health than the federal constitutional derived from the German Constitution. Whether this legislator only complies with the obligations under international law or offers more than what is required by Article 12 of International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights is open to debate, yet it is not discussed in Germany. With regard to innovation, the extension of the right to extraordinary health care is interesting, since it allows innovation for other difficult and presently untreatable diseases. Let's have a look at on the legal practice. In the jurisdiction of the social courts, we find many cases where people claim a right to extraordinary treatment, drawing upon the statute or upon the Constitution. There is a very new study that shows the court's rulings dealing with these claims in about 400 cases. This graph here shows about 400 cases, and about 12% of them are of success of the claimant. More interesting is even that in about 80 cases, preliminary injunctions of the courts had been made, and there about 60% of them had been successful. Quite telling are the demarcation criteria that have developed in this case law. Decisive if a right to extraordinary treatment exists is far less the method of treatment than the type of illness. In general terms, one can say that illnesses by aggressive and difficult to treat tumors lead to the right to extraordinary treatment. And this is going well with the federal court's jurisdiction. However, with regard to the statutory enlargement of this right to comparably severe diseases, this social court's jurisdiction reveals to a rather restrictive interpretation. Why is that so? The social courts view the statute not as an extension, but only as a confirmation of the Federal Constitutional Court's decision. And this narrow view allows them to continue with the previous decisions of the Federal Social Court that granted an extraordinary right to treatment in the case of so-called rare diseases. This jurisdiction says or recognizes a lack in the approval procedure of the Federal Joint Committee regarding very rare diseases. Due to the rarity of the disease, the court says it is out of question that reliable studies will never be available to prove the benefit and efficiency on a new treatment for these rare diseases. If the approval conditions were applied nonetheless, patients with these rare diseases could not get any regular treatment at all. For this reason, according to the Federal Social Court, in such cases, methods can be applied that are approved for other illnesses, off-label use, or lie outside the provisions catalog. The core argument of this reasoning is that the regime for adopting new investigative and treatment methods would not work in these particular cases. This sounds similar to the Federal Constitutional Court, but it isn't. In contrast to the view of the social courts, it does matter whether we argue with the Federal Constitutional Court to help people in the extreme situation of life-threatening and terminal diseases with no reasonable prospect of cure, or we follow the Federal Social Court in helping those who suffer from a rare and therefore not adequately treatable illness. It is two very different ball games whether a case is rare but do not immediately lead to death, or a patient is close to death but her disease is by no means rare. This is quite evident from the individual's perspective. Here I want to draw attention again towards the incentives for innovation involved. Without the jurisdiction of the Federal Constitutional Court, the incentives for innovation in the German healthcare system would lead to more efficiency only. As there is hardly any chance to arouse interest and draw profit from innovations that target only a very small number of people, rare diseases are not on the agenda for innovative research companies. The jurisdiction of the Federal Social Court does not even attempt to encourage innovation that runs counter this economic rationale. Instead, it aims at granting treatment that is probably less appropriate, but at least does not demand innovation on unreasonable costs. In other words, the Federal Social Court understands perfectly the central idea of the public healthcare system, concentrating on efficiency-oriented innovation only. And that is, in my opinion, the deeper meaning of the Federal Constitutional Court's decision. It launched an important incentive for novelty-oriented innovation, waiving all aspects of efficiency. The individual right to treatment in case of life-threatening and terminal diseases, and consequently the monetary compensation for it, allows the research for and the experimentation with new methods, even if their benefit and efficiency cannot be proved, at least cannot be proved today. After the ruling of 2005, there was a rumor going around that the Federal Constitutional Court upheld the right of the plaintiff only because one of the judges was a strong supporter of this esoteric magnetic resonance therapy. A famous proverb in Germany, among German judges, says that sometimes the law is wiser than the legislator. And here I'm tempted to say that sometimes a judgment might be wiser than the judge. Thank you for your attention.